Are we ready to go with the call-in, or do we need to wait a second? Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Matthew Kranig. I'm Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. We're here today for an event in our Cross-Strait Seminar Series, Democracy Under Siege, Advancing Common Values and Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. As many of you may know, the Atlantic Council was founded in 1961 to support the NATO alliance. Since then, we've grown quite a bit, including a vibrant Asia program and Democratic Order Initiative program. And in some ways, what we seek to do is replicate our successful model in Europe, in Asia, having strong partnerships with America's democratic partners and allies in the region to advance common challenges. And that's what we're here to do today, to discuss the United States' efforts, allied efforts to promote democracy in Asia. And we're also here to launch an issue brief by Dr. Karis Templeman of Stanford University, promoting democracy in the Indo-Pacific. Welcome to today's event. I think it should be a fascinating discussion. Joining Dr. Templeman on the panel will be Ash Jain, a senior fellow here at the Scowcroft Center. I'll be joining the panel, and we're very fortunate to have Allison Zawinski from the National Bureau of Asian Research moderate today's discussion. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ms. Zawinski. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. So as Matt noted, it's my distinct pleasure to be here at the Atlantic Council to moderate today's event. He gave a great overview here of kind of the focus of their program and the background on Dr. Templeman's issue brief that we'll be hearing about later today, and some of the questions that we're going to be addressing or thinking about as the panelists provide their remarks include how can democracies in the region, including Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, Indonesia, and Taiwan, cooperate on efforts to promote democracy and advance democratic governance across the region. Where should support for democracy and shared values fit in the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific strategy? And what are the main challenges facing democracies and democratic governments in the next decade? So those are some things that we'll be looking forward to hearing from our panelists about today. So you have, I think, some background on the panelists, but I'll briefly give a little bit of their bio, and then we'll turn it over to them to kick things off. So we'll hear from Dr. Templeman first. He's a social science research scholar at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, where he's the project manager of the Taiwan Democracy and Security Project at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. Karis's research interests are democratization, elections and election management, party system development, dominant party systems, and politics and security issues in Pacific Asia, among other topics. I've had the pleasure of working with Karis over the past year in his capacity of one of MBR's National Asia Research Fellows, so it's a great pleasure to be working with him again here today. And then after Dr. Templeman presents, we'll turn it over to Mr. Ash Jain. He's a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, where he oversees the Atlantic Council's Democratic Order Initiative and D10 Strategy Forum. He previously served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, focusing on U.S. alliances and partnerships, international norms, and challenges to the democratic order, including those posed by Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And then to round it out, we'll turn it over to Dr. Matthew Kroenig. He's the Deputy Director for Strategy at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. His own research focuses on great power competition with China and Russia, emerging technology, and strategic deterrence and weapons nonproliferation. He's also a tenured associate professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. He's previously served in several positions in the U.S. government, including the Strategy Office at the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Strategic Assessment Group at the Central Intelligence Agency. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Templeman for his remarks.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for attending this wonderful event. I also want to thank Allison for agreeing to join. It's good to see you again. Matt and Ash for the invitation to write this brief. And I apologize because I'm not physically there and I can't see the audience, but I've gotten word that there's a representative from the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office there. Jack Wong, are you there?
He said yes.
Yeah, great. I just want to thank you for your continuing support for these kinds of programs and the promotion of democracy related research in the Washington D.C. area and beyond. It's really great work that you're doing and supporting. For my remarks today, the topic I'm going to talk about is promoting democracy in the Indo-Pacific. And I don't know that I will say a whole lot new in this 7 to 10 minutes that I have, but I hope that I might repackage it in a certain way that may be useful to the people in the audience. The point I want to start with is that promoting democracy in the Indo-Pacific region is changing. The need to promote it, the kind of consequences of democracy for larger strategic considerations in the region, and it's changing for a couple of reasons. One is that first and foremost, the rise of Chinese power and influence in the region is making it harder to consolidate democracy. And I'll elaborate on this point in a second. And second, in turn, the struggles that democracies around the world are going through are creating a much more, a less hospitable environment to US and European interests in the rest of the world. And so we should care about democracy promotion in Asia, in part because democracies make better partners and allies. They make better friends. They're easier for us to work with, and they generally produce better outcomes for their own people as well. And so when we see a challenge to the state of democracy in the region and a trend that appears to be undercutting democratic consolidation, we should be worried. That affects us here in the United States as well as the region. To my mind, the biggest threat, as I mentioned, to current arrangements is the rise of Chinese power and influence in the region. This is both in the economic realm, where the Chinese way of doing business is affected by the fact that just about every Chinese firm is ultimately accountable to the Chinese Communist Party. So they are often making investments and taking business decisions based on national strategic interests rather than short-term profit motives. In addition to that, they are often following business practices that don't conform to kind of global best standards. And so they may be involved in underhanded bribery or insider dealing that erodes already weak institutions within many of the countries of the Indo-Pacific. I should clarify that when I talk about the Indo-Pacific, what I'm referring to in the issue brief that I've written is primarily the competitive electorally contested regimes of East Asia and Southeast Asia. So Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and Mongolia in Northeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, East Timor, or Timor-Leste, and Indonesia, I mentioned that, and Thailand and Burma. In addition to the kind of business threat, or the kind of Chinese way of doing business as a potential threat to economic practices in these countries, we also see a kind of Chinese sharp power threat. Chinese economic leverage, particularly in the country that I know best, Taiwan, is used to try to erode or undermine democratic principles and practices. And that includes things like academic freedom, where academics in Taiwan are not. If they express opinions that fall afoul of some Communist Party dogma, they're not issued visas to go visit China. They're often put on a blacklist. It includes artistic expression, so a number of Taiwanese artists, singers, directors, actors have also been blacklisted and are not allowed into the mainland. Their movies and songs are boycotted. And what's particularly alarming in recent years has been the expansion of this use of Chinese economic leverage into what we've traditionally thought of as very stable and very secure democracies in places like Australia or even the United States. So the rise in Chinese foreign students in Australian or Canadian or American universities has made those universities more dependent on their tuition dollars, and then makes them much more sensitive to topics that touch on kind of red lines of the Chinese Communist Party, so Taiwan's status or Hong Kong or Xinjiang. And with the eruption of protests in Hong Kong, this has become much more apparent to a broader public now, this threat. And then the third piece of this Chinese influence picture in the region and beyond is the kind of political practices that Chinese agents engage in. So this Communist Party of China has a branch called the United Front Work Department that engages in a wide array of tactics to try to influence public opinion covertly and coercively in many of these democracies. And again, Taiwan is one of the primary targets of that action, but it's spread far beyond Taiwan now and encompasses places like Australia, the Philippines, and even into North America and the US and Canada. And so there's an inevitable challenge posed by the traditional Chinese way of doing business in the region that threatens to undermine the kind of liberal democratic principles in the liberal democracies and threatens to further erode the illiberal democracies or the flawed democracies of the region. And so I think, given this current moment, I think we need to pay more attention to the challenges of consolidating democracy in the Asia-Pacific region, or we may see further erosion of what remains of liberal freedoms and practices in many of these cases. So let me now turn to the issue of democracy in Asia, the general patterns. As probably everyone in the room knows, democracy in Asia, democracy globally, it has been in retreat for at least a decade, depending on which index you use. Democracy appears to have gone into a recession between about 2005 to 2008. The Freedom House, a measure of freedom in the world, has recorded its 13th consecutive year of declines in freedom throughout the world. And Asia is not immune from these trends. There have been declines in some of the key democracies or key competitive regimes in Asia as well. But unlike other parts of the world, democracy is quite young in Asia. It's a recent transplant, and there are some surprisingly resilient cases of democracy in the region. So Indonesia is really still a success story. It's had regular rotations of power. It's managed to kind of consolidate a reasonably high quality democracy. It has a critical media and so forth. The history of democracy and democracy promotion in the region is quite complex. The brief kind of lays out the details, so I won't go into too much here, but I would just note there's very different political problems in very different democracies or competitive regimes in the region. So in Taiwan and South Korea, for instance, they have high state capacity, they're generally well governed, and so the transition to democracy then has preceded a fairly rapid consolidation there. In other cases, such as the Philippines, low state capacity and an inability to deliver the goods and govern well has undermined support for democracy there. And so the challenge of consolidation in Taiwan and Korea is much different than the challenge in the Philippines. The third topic I'd like to turn to is, so what's the state of democracy promotion today in the region? And I'll put that in quotes, democracy promotion, because as I'll talk about in a moment, I think that term is potentially loaded or problematic. But if we look at all of the kind of economic, political, and security activity in the region, there's actually quite a lot, and a lot of positive developments. So the U.S. is by far the most active still, with the free and open Indo-Pacific initiative to promote good governance, liberal values, and the rule of law in the region. I invite you to take a look at the State Department report released last month that details in pretty extensively all of the United States efforts in the region and the various partnerships that we have to promote the broad goal of a free and open Indo-Pacific. But in the report, I detail what I think are less known activities by some of the other major democracies in the region, including efforts by Japan, by Taiwan, by Korea, Indonesia, and Australia, and increasingly and excitingly, I think, jointness between these countries. So Japan and India, for instance, have now set up an annual meeting at the ministerial level to discuss a broad array of issues, but among them includes promoting a kind of liberal order in the region. And so that's a new development that would have been unheard of 10 to 15 years ago. But the current state of democracy promotion is still mostly bilateral. The United States does something, or Japan does something with one or two other targets. There's not a kind of sustained multilateral cooperative framework in which to engage in promoting political reform in the region. And so I'm running out of time, but let me talk briefly about three recommendations that come out of the issue brief, and I invite you to take a look at that where I elaborate on these. The first is to move, when the United States is meeting with allies and partners in the region and discussing things that we can do jointly, that discussion, I think, needs to move beyond hard security, particularly to economics. I know I'm not saying anything particularly new, given the Atlantic Council's work beating the drum on this issue, but I do think creating a kind of a more systematic and open and transparent rules of the road, so to speak, for economic activity in the region is a key way to hinder or to react to and to blunt some of the more nefarious Chinese activities in the region. The second is, I think the term democracy promotion is, at least in some countries in the region, quite a sensitive and perhaps loaded term with some negative connotations. Ever since the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, that has become associated with a kind of U.S. freedom agenda that is very much U.S.-centric and could easily be perceived as a threat to some countries in the region. And so the kind of a la carte, so to speak, approach of the free and open Indo-Pacific approach of this administration, I think, is actually pretty close to where it needs to be, where different countries can kind of sign on for smaller pieces of a broader democracy promotion agenda. So promoting good governance, promoting greater political accountability of regimes to their people, promoting capacity building, state capacity, or the rule of law. Different sets of countries both have different needs and are going to be more or less willing to sign on to each of those pieces. And so I think the overall framework of the free and open Indo-Pacific makes a lot of sense. And I have to confess, I didn't know that I was going to end up there when I was writing this brief. But by the time I kind of got to a conclusion, I decided I agreed with the current approach to a large extent. And then the last point I'll make, and then I'll stop because I'm over time, is one piece that I think is underappreciated here is the role of non-state actors in the region. Many of the democracies, such as Taiwan or Korea or Japan, have very vibrant civil society sectors. Even the Philippines or Indonesia, there's a lot of cross-national NGO collaboration, but I think there could be more, and I think that could provide a more robust multilateral framework for positive political change in the region. And so anything that the United States or other partners and allies in the region can do to promote positive work by non-governmental organizations is a good thing. So a model for this, again, because I know Taiwan best, I'm going to talk about the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, which is funded primarily from Taiwan government sources, but also in turn then turns around and funds multilateral NGO activities throughout the region, including an elections network that monitors elections through the region and has made some real useful contributions to ensuring the free and fairness of elections in the region. Another non-state actor is universities. I think there's a kind of common set of concerns among universities, especially in the democratic part of the region, and promoting greater collaboration and a kind of code of conduct for how to deal with sensitive issues, especially involving China and territorial issues, could be helpful. And the third, I'd note, since I've spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, Facebook and Google have an obvious presence there. They're often making decisions that have national ramifications in the countries they're operating in with very little kind of context-specific knowledge of the region. They're often subcontracting this out. And I think I don't want to overstate it, but there's certainly a willingness of them to have more conversations about kind of multilateral approach to a lot of the thorny free speech issues that they're running into these days. So I do think the potential impact of non-state actors within a broader democracy promotion framework in the region is an underappreciated one and one we should highlight. So I'll wrap up my formal comments there and turn it over to the panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Templeman. And with that, we'll turn it over to Mr. Jain.
All right. Well, thank you. I first want to begin by commending this paper that Karis has written. I think it's quite substantive and very interesting and provides a lot of good insight into the state of democracy in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. I just want to make 3 brief points and look forward to getting into Q&A and hearing from the rest of you. But just stepping back, and as I read the report, it struck me as pretty remarkable if you think about where this region was 2 or 3 decades ago and where it is today when it comes to the advancement of democratization. U.S. policy in Europe for many decades has been focused on a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. And really the same could be said generally about U.S. policy in Asia. Advancing freedom, advancing security in the region have both been important priorities. And as Karis makes clear in the report, we're starting to see, we have seen the strategic context and the direction of democracy in the region moving in a positive direction for the past 2 decades. I'll quote something that struck me in your paper where you say, with the end of the Cold War, the international environment in which these young democracies in Asia initially emerged became relatively benign. The traditional major powers in the region, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, are all democracies and have welcomed political liberalization. And as you point out, the countries, a range of countries in the region, from New Zealand to Indonesia to Taiwan and Mongolia, have embraced this kind of trend towards democratization and have established a robust core and a network of democracies in the Indo-Pacific that is important and noteworthy and actually presents quite a bit of opportunities for the U.S. and its allies. And that brings me to the second point that I want to emphasize here, which is the need formalize mechanisms of cooperation among democracies in the Indo-Pacific so that we can advance these shared goals of security and values and a rules-based order. The Quad is a particularly useful and potentially quite impactful initiative, the Indo-Pacific Quad, which Karis talks about in the report, and as many of you may know, is a security partnership between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. The Quad has been in existence at various levels for a number of years, but for the first time this past September, the Quad met at the foreign minister level, and it is important as a way of promoting cooperation among major democracies that have a presence in the region and advancing kind of liberal norms. Although it has been security focused, it also provides the beginnings of what could become a really robust framework for cooperation on a broader set of issues relating to the rules-based order and democracy promotion. And I think we should start to look at it that way. And then finally, I want to just say a word about Taiwan's role in this framework. As a democratic partner, Taiwan has an important role to play and is poised, I think, more uniquely today than ever in terms of advancing democratic values in the region. As Karis points out, Taiwan was the first country in Asia to establish a foundation specifically relating to democracy promotion, the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. And there's another framework that's been in place for the past few years which provides great potential to expand that cooperation. It's called the U.S. Taiwan Global Cooperation and Training Framework, a long phrase, but it's a vehicle that represents a way to initially bilaterally between the U.S. and Taiwan to expand cooperation on regional challenges beyond just security. And for the first time earlier this year, Japan was invited to join this framework, and officials from the U.S., Taiwan, and Japan met at a conference to discuss expanding the rule of law in the region. And I think this could be another vehicle to build upon and to maybe bring in some of the Quad partners, for instance, and others to participate in a network of shared practices and advancing democratic values in the region. And especially in the context of China and the pushback that China has been acting upon in recent years to those kinds of values, I think it's especially important to build on these kinds of networks of cooperation. So I'll stop there. I think there's more we can get into during the Q&A. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Ash. Over to you, Matt.
Great. Thank you. I'd also like to begin by thanking the Taiwan government, TECRO, and Jack Wang for the support of this important work. And I'd also like to begin, some of you who may be familiar with my research may wonder what I'm doing on a panel on democracy. A lot of my work recently has focused more on nuclear weapons issues. But actually my original academic interest was in democracy and democracy promotion. I published my first book on legislative strength around the world. I was involved in developing this varieties of democracy data set that's widely used by scholars now to measure democracy around the world. And in a forthcoming book, I'm bringing these interests together. I have a new book coming out in the spring called The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy from the Ancient World to the US and China. And so some of my remarks are going to be really drawn from this most recent book and kind of the role of democracy in this new era of great power competition. And so this is one of the things I really liked about Dr. Templeman's report. I agree with Ash. It's quite substantive and well-researched, and I would recommend it. But I like that it recognizes how geopolitics affects domestic political regime type. I think often scholars who focus on democracy are focusing on domestic politics and can miss the bigger geopolitical context. But after World War II, 1945, there were only about a dozen democracies in the world. And over the past 70 years, we've seen the numbers of democracies around the world grow exponentially, close to 100 today. And I think a large part of that is a story of American power, promoting democracy first within U.S. Spheres of influence in Europe and Asia, after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism as an alternative model, the embrace of democracies by more countries around the world. And so I think in the post-Cold War era, we've seen, of course, we all know the phrase at the end of history that democratic capitalism was the only legitimate form of government. Now with the return of great power competition, challenges from autocratic rivals, Russia and China, there's another game in town. And as Dr. Templeman pointed out, over the past 13 years, we've seen a decrease in the number of democracies around the world in every successive year, and I think these trends are related. So this brings me to my second point, that I do think that this is an ideological competition between the United States and its autocratic rivals. It's a competition about domestic political models, in addition to other things. There are some people who would say this new era of great power competition, it's just realpolitik, nation states jockeying for power and influence. But I do think it is also about what is the legitimate form of government around the world. And some scholars have said, well, China's not actively advocating for a state-led, capitalist, autocratic form of government. And I think that's debatable. If you look at some of the things that China's doing in terms of giving technology to countries around the world that will help them oppress their populations, I think that China is, in a way, exporting its model. In addition, whether it's conscious or not, I think there are many autocratic rulers around the world who look at China as a model to emulate, that it gives them the excuse to say to their people, I can continue to provide you with economic development even if I don't provide you with political opportunity. Look at the China model. So I think this is an ideological competition in addition to power politics, economic and technological one. And I think this shouldn't be a surprise. This was really always the case. If in my book, I go all the way back to the Peloponnesian Wars. But the Peloponnesian Wars was about political model as well, with Athens supporting democratic city-states, the Spartans supporting oligarchies. And at the end of the war, if you'll remember, Sparta overthrows Athens, and what's the first thing it does? It gets rid of democracy and establishes an oligarchy. So I think this idea of great powers exporting their domestic models as part of competition is not new. It's 2,500 years old, and Napoleonic Wars and many other examples through history. So this gets to my third and final point, that then I do think that for the United States and its allies and democratic partners, defending democracy and democracy promotion has to be an important part of the strategy. And so I think there are values and normative-based reasons why that makes sense. I think that democracies have proven that they're better at protecting the human rights and the welfare of their people. But I also think there's a hard power argument to it as well. There's a lot of evidence now that on average democracies have higher long-run rates of economic growth, have better financial systems, are better at building alliances, have more soft power, have certain military advantages. And so I think there's a hard power reason for the United States and its allies to emphasize their democratic strengths as well. Ash didn't mention it, but Ash and I published a major report a few weeks ago on how to revitalize the rules-based international system. And it's available in the lobby or on the Atlantic Council website if you're interested. But one of the things we point out is just the importance of America's democratic alliances as one of its major strengths in this great power competition. If you look at GDP per capita, U.S. GDP per capita is now about 23, share of world GDP. U.S. share of world GDP is about 23%. Chinese share of world GDP is about 15%, so that's getting a little bit close for comfort. If you add in, however, America's democratic allies and other democracies around the world, that's 75% of world GDP. So if the United States can work with its democratic allies, other democratic partners around the world, still maintains a preponderance of power that I and Ash wrote, we think can allow it to continue to advance this rules-based international system that's provided so many benefits over the past 70 years. So I'll finish my remarks there and very much look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Koenig. All right, so before we turn it over to Q&A, I'll give you guys a few minutes to kind of ruminate on all of the comments that you've heard and think of some great questions. But I'll kind of kick it off. Before this panel started, I asked our presenters if they were familiar with some remarks that Assistant Secretary of State Stilwell gave at Brookings Institution last week. Some of you might be familiar with them. If you're not, it's totally fine. But my point was that in his remarks, it's one of the first times that I've heard from the administration, from the Trump administration, an approach that seems to speak a little bit more to some of the sensitivities that Karas flagged in his concluding remarks in Southeast Asia, in parts of potentially Oceania, some smaller states, to hearing words like promotion of democracy. And what Secretary Stilwell kind of emphasized is an approach of pluralism. So he, I'll read from some of his remarks here. He said, "We support pluralistic systems governed by freedom, rule of law, and respect for the rights of one's neighbors. A pluralistic Asia is one in which the region's diverse countries can continue to thrive as they wish." And nowhere in his remarks did Secretary Stilwell say democracy, promotion of democracy. He used many words like rule of law, governance. So my question for this panel is if we can kind of jump into the debate around, in US policy, how we best navigate some of the sensitivities in the region, in Southeast Asia, in some specific countries, around being too forceful with promotion of democracy, of adhering to values the United States wants to see, with achieving our objectives of, doing just that, of making sure that we have an order in Asia that is free and open and has democratic governance as a standard. So I would kind of open it up to you all to kind of get some of your thoughts on that, and what's the best approach for U.S. strategy going forward. And I can see you, Karas, so if you have something you want to say, just kind of flag me.
Okay. Let me throw out one thought on that and then toss it over to the rest of you. I don't want to downplay the idea that democracy and supporting democracy is important. I think it is, and it's survived and flourished and expanded in the world today precisely because the United States has been such a forceful proponent of that model. But the sensitivities, I think, have to do with in part, the U.S. history in the region and our kind of hypocritical nature about supporting certain regimes that are not democratic because of larger geostrategic interests, and then turning around and arguing that other regimes that are not in our sphere of influence or part of our allies and partners need to democratize. And so I think in particular, it's the U.S. role as kind of front and center in democracy promotion that is particularly sensitive. And so let me put it this way. If the U.S. is the one leading the charge, then it becomes very sensitive. If it's India and Japan, by contrast, and they're out there in front arguing for greater civil liberties, greater rule of law, opposition party development, then there's some cover, and then there's I think it's less sensitive and it's a more compelling argument if it comes from effectively Asian peer states than if it comes from the kind of from an Asian perspective, a dogmatic U.S. Set of demands.
Great.
Yeah, I could jump in on that. I understand the U.S. approach, which is to build this broader coalition of partners, especially as we deal with China's rising influence in the region. And so calling this network something other than a collaboration of democracies, makes sense if we want to include the Singaporeans or the Malaysians or the Philippines or others who have been, whose records on democracy have been questionable in recent years. And so free and open Indo-Pacific, is one term that the administration has been using to kind of broaden it, or pluralism or pluralistic engagement, as you're referring to, kind of provides another way of organizing this coalition. But at the same time, I think it's really important to maintain and make it clear what it is that our approach is geared towards in terms of the goals. and promoting democratic change, promoting democratic values, and the protection of fundamental freedoms in all of the countries across the Asia-Pacific should be front and center of what U.S. policy is. In fact, I think you're talking about playing into this perception of hypocrisy. In fact, that's exactly what these terms are suggesting, is that we don't want to, we don't want to anger or be confrontational towards some of these non-democracies in the region, and we're giving them a pass, essentially, if we're going to start avoiding terms like democracy and human rights. And I think I think there's a way to do both. Yes, we want to maintain this coalition of partners to deal with China's influence, but we also want to make it clear that the closest that we will consider as our closest allies and partners, those that adhere to those norms of democracy.
Great. Matt, anything to add?
I think they nailed both sides of the debate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm happy to further tease out some of the strains of this, but I do want to give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. So maybe you can also follow on any of that or any new topics. So I just ask you to raise your hand, and if you can provide your name and affiliation, and please keep your comments to a question. That'd be great. All right, so I saw one over here.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Philip Cornell here at the Atlantic Council and the Global Energy Center. Thanks very much for everyone here for joining the panel. It's really interesting. Part of the paper talks a little bit about the role of the BRI in infrastructure in expanding a lot of Chinese influence and potentially their influence on the political structures in those countries. I was just wondering, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy talks about, criteria for quality infrastructure, which is important and I think a good move forward. My question is, are there specific infrastructures, particularly I'm thinking sort of networked power systems, networked ICT structures, et cetera, that cause particular concern from like a democratic perspective for any of you? Thanks very much.
Good to see Karis, right? Do you want to take it, Karis?
In the paper I came down, I focused primarily on kind of big, expensive construction projects that involve government tenders and the procurement process as a kind of a process that's susceptible to corruption or manipulation in a way that undermines accountability and transparency and the rule of law. And so that could cover all kinds of things. I didn't really touch on the broader concerns about, say, Chinese ownership or control of certain critical infrastructure, such as ports or roads or highways or electrical grids. Now that I think about it, that may be worth adding in to the brief if I have an opportunity to. But my initial concern was mostly about the effect, because we live in a democracy that has dealt with this problem a lot, where contracts are often bid out to or won by a construction cartel or that sort of thing, and we've developed a lot of mechanisms to try to combat this sort of underhanded dealing or corruption. And the Chinese standard operating procedure has been to engage very directly in that kind of underhanded competition. And so anything that involves a kind of letting out of a big contract under opaque terms with no bids, I think that's problematic, not only for that particular project, but for the broader institutionalization of the rule of law and of accountability in those regimes.
So I'll, one of the big questions, as was pointed out, is what will be the effect of China's Belt and Road Initiative? Some have said this is kind of like part of China's grand strategy. And I think there are signs that China is increasing its influence in many regions around the world through BRI. On the other hand, I think we are also starting to see a backlash form, and Dr. Templeton's paper points to this, and in particular the Sri Lanka case where China essentially seized a port in Sri Lanka after Sri Lanka was unable to make the terms of the debt repayment. And so this idea that the BRI is a debt trap is an idea that's gaining some traction, and you have seen some governments around the world say no thanks or try to renegotiate their terms of BRI investments with China because of this. Another reason there's a backlash forming is that a lot of these investments, the Chinese aren't relying on local workers. They're bringing in Chinese firms, Chinese workers, and so the host populations aren't getting the benefits that they had hoped for with some of these investments. And already in Central Asia, you've seen a couple of major anti-China protests. I think one of the things we see historically is that autocracies can be clumsy in their diplomacy, and I think we may be seeing that in BRI, although the story's still being written. One of the big questions for the United States and its allies is how to deal with BRI, and this is something that Ash and I talk about in our paper a little bit. Do we try to develop counters to it? And I think that's one of the things that the free and open Indo-Pacific is meant to provide, a counter to BRI. I would point out that there are some differences of opinion on this, and there are some experts who argue, no, the better way to take the edges off BRI would be for the United States and its allies to engage with it and take Chinese statements at face value that they're open to partnering with other nations on this. I think it's a more provocative and counterintuitive approach, but we at the Scowcroft Center did publish a strategy paper on this just a couple of years ago, if you're interested, on how the United States and its allies should work with BRI, not against it, as a way to diffuse some of the influence that China may be gaining from these investments, and also to try to make sure that it does reach the high standards of international infrastructure investment standards that China says that it wants to abide by.
You know, on that kind of backlash that we're seeing in some places, there was an interesting case a week or so ago in the news that a province in the Solomon Islands, which, as many of you know, has switched its recognition this past year from recognizing Taiwan to recognizing China, the governor of this province agreed to a contract with a U.S. contracting company to develop a port there, and specifically in his comments to the media referenced the fact that he did not want his province to fall under control of Chinese companies and wanted the United States to help protect them from the Chinese coming into their island, which it spoke to a whole host of other issues related to some domestic governance issues in the Solomon Islands, that you would have the government of the country taking one position and then the province taking a different position. But putting that aside, it's another prominent example where you're seeing some pretty strong feelings about what countries not just in Southeast Asia are seeing, but also Oceania, related to China's construction practices and corruption as well. All right, great. So we'll take a few more questions. All right, back here, Melody.
Hi, I'm Melody Heim with Guidehouse. So I wanted to jump off of Dr. Koenig's Sri Lanka point. I was wondering if the panel could expand a little bit more on the smaller South Asian states, specifically how the U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific strategy can work to incorporate the smaller states like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and in the other vein, how India and the U.S., how that kind of relationship also affects these smaller South Asian states, especially given how India's foreign policy is a neighbor-first policy.
Who wants to go first?
I'll defer to
right.
the India expert on the panel on that one, I think.
I'll just maybe say a couple things on the question as it pertains to first to India. So it's as I noted, and I think your paper does too. India has been playing an increasingly more robust role when it comes to promoting kind of democratic practices and values across the region. For a long time, India was very internally focused and didn't want to project or didn't adopt a foreign policy that projected values or norms outside into the region. And so now we're seeing India increasingly willing to play that role, and especially in its own neighborhood. It's taken a more of a posture of supporting and protecting nascent democracies like Bangladesh and Nepal. And so I think from our perspective, from the U.S. perspective, India is a good partner to turn to as a projection in order to help project these kinds of policy goals. So we should work closely with the Indians and encourage that kind of engagement in the region. And by a similar token to your question about these smaller countries, whether South Asia or elsewhere, are vulnerable to Chinese influence, and we've seen that with Sri Lanka play out directly. It's important to provide directly to some of these countries or with other democratic partners like India and Japan in the region, a way for them, an alternative for them to consider when they're being approached by the Chinese for any kind of these major infrastructure projects. Because the economic pressure certainly is there. They want investment from the Chinese or from whatever sources, and they may often be forced to consider the strings that come along with that investment. Sometimes it's not transparent. Sometimes it's corrupt, or officials in these governments are are subject to being manipulated or engage in kind of illicit practices that then the Chinese can use to deepen that kind of engagement. So there's a role. There's certainly a role for outside players to help give these smaller countries a way to deal with the pressure they're feeling from the Chinese.
Anything else to add?
Yeah, can I pick up on something that's related to both of these, both the question from the audience and a point that Allison made? And that is, there are some significant second-order consequences to increasing Chinese influence and investment in these smaller states on the periphery of India, but also in the kind of Pacific Island states especially. And that is, there's some major security implications for the United States. We're in a security arrangement where we're almost kind of going back to the past, where small islands are again very strategically important in the event of a kind of U.S.-China conflict. And so the United States actually strongly opposed the Solomon Islands switch to the People's Republic of China, and actually worked very closely with the Taiwanese government to try to counter Chinese efforts to make that switch. And there were a couple of alarming things about that change that go above and beyond any of the other recent diplomatic switches to the PRC. The first is that Taiwan actually directed a lot of resources to try to counter the Chinese efforts there. And second, the United States actually openly and explicitly opposed the switch. And in the end, it didn't matter. There was a real policy thing that suggests that we need to, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is, I think, a good kind of broad brand, but in terms of execution and coordination, we're up against a very formidable ally or adversary in the region in certain situations. And so this was, I think, a sobering moment for just how much United States influence in the region has slipped relative to China. I'd also note the strategic importance of the island that was supposed to be leased out to the Chinese. It was actually Tulagi, which is, if you know your World War II history, it was a critical island in the Guadalcanal campaign. And it has a similar kind of strategic importance today, which is one reason why the United States and the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii was so concerned about that switch. And so I haven't talked too much about the security implications of democratic erosion and the use of kind of underhanded means to switch relations. But I do think there are some really fundamental ones, especially as we get towards the Pacific and the Pacific Island states for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just add, I'm not a deep South Asia expert by any means, but I was in Sri Lanka recently and actually went to visit the port area that had been taken over by the Chinese, and I was talking to local officials. And one of the things I heard over and over is that they are somewhat uncomfortable with the Chinese presence, but that they need roads, they need bridges, they need ports, and as far as they saw it, China's really the only game in town right now. And so I think this just underscores the points that Ash and Dr. Templeman were making about the need to have an alternative. And I think that would be a fair criticism of kind of U.S. and allied broader strategy in great power competition. If you look at the national security strategy and national defense strategy, they say we're in this era of great power competition, but it doesn't really provide a clear strategy for what we do about it. And I think that's okay. We're in the early stages. It took us a while to settle on our successful strategy of deterrence and containment during the Cold War. But I think it is time for us to go beyond recognizing some of these problems and move on to developing effective counters to them.
All right.
Thank you. My name is Sundar Ramanujam. I am a research associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also a product of Georgetown's Democracies and Governance. A lot of what you said resonates with my classwork. I wanted to touch upon your last point and the recurring theme in this panel discussion. One, which is that the Chinese are sort of the only game in town in a lot of these places that countries are turning towards for Chinese investments. I wonder institutions that the U.S. and its allies like the Japanese set up, like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, that enjoy a whole lot more legitimacy and have a lot more operations than individual bilateral players themselves. If they can be revitalized or if there is an opportunity for them to be relevant again, especially considering Professor Templeton's recommendation that the a la carte options for democracy reform, I know that the bank has always been apolitical, and I put that in quotes, but are there things like fiscal transparency or data governance or the use of digital infrastructure? Can we have these institutions play a bigger role? I just wanted to see your reactions on that.
Great question. All right, Chris, go ahead.
Well, I can give you my quick reaction. The we in that sentence is doing a lot of work. They're not really our institutions anymore, because China's a member, and so their Chinese influence in those institutions is significant and growing as well. And so if they attempt to get involved, say, in countering a Chinese proposal in the Solomon Islands, that then creates a political fight within the institution. And so I guess I'm a little bit concerned about the ability of the kind of pre-existing global financial and banking institutions to serve as an effective counter to the BRI, certainly. But I guess another way to put this is that the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank look very similar in terms of membership and activities, and one is a Chinese-led bank and another is a Japanese-led bank, and they're both kind of constrained or motivated by the same issues. So it's not clear to me that these can effectively function as a broad counterweight to something like the BRI in a way that they might have been able to even 10 or 15 years ago.
Well, so I think this is a theme that Ash and I cover in our recent strategy paper on revitalizing and adapting the rules-based international system. Because the World Bank and the IMF, were part of this system set up by the United States and its allies at the end of World War II. This rules-based order has been effective over the past 70 years, and many people see it under threat now because of the rise of China, other developments. And so there are some who say, that's an old system. It was set up in 1945. It doesn't work anymore. It's destined to erode. I think there are some have criticized Joe Biden, for example, for seeming to say, well, we'll just go back to the way we have always done things. If I get elected, we'll go back to 1995. I don't think that makes sense either. The world has changed. And so one of the things that Ash and I recommend in this report is that the United States needs to work together with its allies to revitalize and adapt these institutions for a new era. And so we have some specific ideas for how to do that in trade, with military alliances. We don't take on development directly, but I think the general approach could be the same, that the United States gets together with its leading democratic partners and talks about how do we revitalize these development institutions for 2020, because it's not 1945 anymore, it's not 1991 anymore.
Great. All right. Take a few more questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Krista. I'm with Global Language Network, which is an NGO. So I was going to ask then about what do you see being the role or the changing role of language and language learning in terms of democracy promotion broadly throughout the region? Thank you.
Role of language. Oh, that's good. Karis, go ahead.
I'm deferring to our author when appropriate, so you can have first dibs, Karis, but I've got a thought if
I don't know if I have a ready-made answer to this. I'm going to have to think a little bit about it.
All right, ponder that.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that I thought of immediately was China's Confucius Institutes.
Yeah.
So as you probably know, it's setting up these institutions around the world, including in the United States, funded explicitly by the CCP propaganda arm. So China is offering free language lessons, Chinese language lessons around the world. But in addition to that, these Confucius Institutes are also promoting Chinese propaganda, including, I think, messages that undermine democracy, saying that China does have an appropriate and better model than the United States. So I think this is another element of defending democracy in this era of great power competition. Now, the United States has started to respond to this to some degree, has recently announced that the U.S. government will no longer provide language training funding to universities that accept, or funding for language training to universities that accept money from Confucius Institutes. So essentially forcing universities in the United States to choose, do you want your Chinese language supported by the U.S. government or by the CCP propaganda arm, has caused a couple of countries to shut down Confucius Institutes, including at Arizona State University. So that's, I think, a beginning of a response to that problem, but I think there's likely much more that could be done.
I could just add a small point on that. It's an interesting question, but it strikes me that one of the underappreciated soft power advantages that the U.S. has is the popularity of English around the world, and the demand for learning English, especially among younger people, because that's seen as the ticket to success, whether in business or diplomacy or just pop culture generally. So I'm not sure how to take advantage of that or whether we need to, because it's happening by itself. I mean, this is coming from within. But it does serve as a counterforce maybe to the kinds of things Matt was just talking about, where the Chinese are trying to impose through language and through these kinds of investments their own kind of brand.
And of course, another important counterforce to that is that we don't want to be necessarily stifling language learning. Exactly. There is an important role, very important role, to studying Chinese, to studying other languages in Asia, to help us understand and really craft effective policy. And so I think the other side of that coin is, yes, put up some restrictions that limit the funding to universities that take money from Confucius Institutes, but also provide funding for language learning programs that, like the Critical Language Fellowship, like the Boren, give students an opportunity to also get area studies and language expertise that benefit U.S. policy.
Yeah.
Karis?
Okay, I've thought of something that I can add, and that is in Chinese language instruction. China is not the only place you can go to do that. You can also, the People's Republic of China is not. You can also do it in Taiwan, and having studied language in both places, I think Taiwan is a far superior place to learn the language. I also note that at Stanford, where I'm at, there's been a lot of trouble recruiting students to actually study abroad in China because of initially very high language requirements, and then just the difficulty in attracting students to live in Beijing. They recently moved the study abroad program to Hong Kong just in time for the protests to break out, and they have actually suspended the program that they hadn't even started yet there. And so Taiwan is actually a nice kind of island of prosperity and security and relative friendliness to people who want to learn Chinese language, and is just, I think, a generally better place to pick up the language. And so taking this more broadly, we can think of language learning opportunities for American-based students as we probably should be prioritizing our partners and allies as well, at least for the first kind of initial language acquisition period. And so supporting language exchange in Taiwan, I think, is an important, it could be an important element of a language-based element of the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Mike?
Thanks very much for the panel. I'm Mike Fonte. I work for the Democratic Progressive Party here in Washington. Thanks for the presentation. I think Taiwan would like to break out of the always being seen in the Cross-Strait issue, as if that's the only thing going on, and rather be seen as a partner, as you've already mentioned, Karis, in the region and helping build the region. And I think one way I'd like to hear what you have to say about whether there can be Taiwan, Japan, and maybe with the new OPIC Build Act, sustainable development programs built on the ground that don't necessarily try to counter BRI because they won't be that big and splashy, but be effective meeting the needs at the local level. And I wonder if you had any comments on those.
Yeah, so there's some obvious things that jumped out at me when I was thinking about Taiwan's kind of comparative advantages in terms of economic or democracy or good governance promotion in the region. One is disaster capacity, the response to natural catastrophes. Taiwan gets a lot of typhoons. It's an earthquake-prone region, and there's a very good disaster response capacity in Taiwan that is quite relevant to many of the other countries. I mean, this is the Pacific Rim we're talking about, so volcanoes and earthquakes and typhoons are a very common thing. Cooperation on that seems like an obvious low-hanging fruit to try to expand, particularly with the Japanese. And this is going to stretch my knowledge, but I'm dimly aware of efforts under the new southbound policy of the DPP to try to enhance those cooperation. Yeah, another thing that jumps out actually is people-to-people exchanges. So the Taiwanese new southbound policy actually has created visa-free access from several Southeast Asian countries to Taiwan. And so the number of Southeast Asian students studying in Taiwan has skyrocketed. And to tie this back to what I said before, there are many of them going to Taiwan to learn Chinese. And that kind of greater openness to the countries of Southeast Asia, I think, is a lesson that Japan and Korea could learn as well. And I think Taiwan has kind of shown the way for how to increase people-to-people exchanges, despite its formal diplomatic isolation.
Okay. Anything else?
Nothing.
No? No? All right. So if there aren't any other questions, I think we've reached a nice concluding point. Do any of our speakers have any final thoughts they want to share?
Well, I'd just like to thank Dr. Templeman again for an excellent report. Again, recommend it to anyone who hasn't already seen it. Thank again TechRow for their support, both for democracy in the world and for this important work. And thanks to all of you and to my fellow panelists for spending time with us today.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. Thanks to everybody. Let's give another round of applause to our presenters.